bar stool, she took off her ring.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is origins and like where people come from.
Totally.
Sort of physically, where they come from, emotionally, where they come from creatively. So I said, where do you come from? Thinking about all of those things.
Yeah.
Thinking about place, thinking about all of the factors that went into your development as a writer and how you think about yourself in that way.
Yeah, I love that you talk about it in terms of origins and not just where do you come from, you know, because I think, like I can think about that in terms of language, like where does the registers of my language come from? Not necessarily like always my spoken language, but like my written language. And that was something I think a lot like consciously about with White Nights actually, was how do those registers of language reflect the people that were in that book? So talking about like socioeconomic class and time period, and all the writers I always really admired dealt a lot with that. So people like Flannery O'Connor to like Barry Hannah's stories about the South, to country music that I grew up on, like Kenny Rogers, where it's always like, you know, there's a bar in Toledo across from the depot, you know, so it's the place, but then it's also like begins the character, like there's a bar stool, you know, she took off her ring, and it begins about the woman, like, you know, she was gonna have an affair with this guy that night. And that album actually was the first album that I ever memorized as a kid, and I think of it as like my first short story collection, the Kenny Rogers Greatest Hits, because it's all about these people and their weird like lives. Like you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille, is about like we had 4 hungry children and crops in the field, and that was my first conception, that and probably like Joni Mitchell's songs, of what a story was. So I think I came to story through music pretty much. So in terms of origin, I think that I always think about origin of language as related to like where did you first hear language. And I think the other place I come from is the place that this book is set. So I grew up on a dirt road, like the last dirt road, dead-end dirt road in a small town in New England, and it was just funny because a lot of people have mistaken it for upstate New York, I think, because that's where I live now. Like a couple of the reviews that came out and stuff were like, oh, it's sleepless in upstate New York. And I was like, it's actually sleepless in Massachusetts, but that's okay. But that was kind of part of the fun of it too, was like, I think I liked the fact that there was that kind of weird illusion between people's understandings of what rural place this is exactly. I mean, the novel talks about like Fay Mountain, and it talks about the house being called the bottom feeder, but it doesn't, I felt like those things were like transmutable enough that they can be kind of applied to any small town, so it certainly could be upstate New York. But my sense of place was really a huge important part of me as a kid. And in fact, my first like demonstration was when we had to leave. I loved living in that rural place. I mean, it was fantastic. You could ride your bike everywhere. My dad and I and my sister had horses, so we had like a paddock in the back, and my dad had this big 17-hand horse, and my sister had a little pony, and I had kind of adopted my ex like riding teacher's old quarter horse or whatever, and there were all these trails in back of the house, so we could literally like trail ride on the weekends. There was a guy that was like supposedly a doctor who owned a bunch of property there. And I just couldn't imagine life being any better than that. I think in a lot of ways that's why I ended up here. I mean, it's definitely not lost on me that like, this is a dirt road. There's like a dead end road sign at the end of it. Yeah, I feel like therapeutically thinking, I'm like, okay, I've come back here to like reclaim it, right? To finish the action. Maybe that's part of it. Like, I think the trauma of that was that we had to leave. When I was in 7th grade, we moved to kind of a suburban area nearby because they had a better school system. And that was my first like major enacted trauma. Like, I wouldn't go see the house that my parents were building. I like would literally lie on the floor of my mother's caravan and like let my body go like limp and refuse to move. And I like made them carry me into the house. And so I think where I come from was a big part of this book. Like, I mean, so much of it is in terms of what happens and things is there are fictional elements, but the sense of place is super real to me.
What about the people? I mean, you mentioned like the people in the Kenny Rogers song, and the people who enact a landscape and sort of make it what it is. Is it?
Yeah, totally. There was a bunch of characters that lived on this road. And it was just interesting because my sister and I were the only kids, or the only 2 girls that lived on that road. There was like the brood of abandoned boys that lived up the hill, and then there was the Beavers, who he was like the town dentist, and his daughter Chrissy was a babysitter for us for a while. And his son John was like, I remember when computers first came out, and this was something I wanted to put in the book but just never got in there, that he was a computer for Halloween, like back in probably like 87 or something like that, you know? And he came down and was in a big like cardboard box, and we were literally, like, I remember literally looking at him and being like, what is he, you know? And he was a computer. And, which was funny because my dad actually worked in computers, but yeah, the people are a big part of it. There was the old like cranky guy, you know, legend farmer across the road with horses who people kind of admired and thought was crazy. There was Sue, who worked at the farm stand, who had big personality, and we used to always ride our bikes there and get like, they had those honey sticks you could get and get like a piece of fruit or whatever. That was big, like being able to be grown up enough to ride your bike to the farm stand. And bizarrely, that neighborhood actually, yeah, there was a child that was abducted nearby that became this kind of famous case, and she was on the bus stop before us, so because it was a dirt road, the bus didn't have to come up the road. We would walk down the road and wait at the stop sign for the bus. And the little girl, who looked just like my sister actually, was kidnapped like within our area when she'd been, yeah, so it was a bizarre place because there was a sense of hominess about it, but there was something about it that had like this sense of rural remove where like kind of anything can happen, you know? And I think a lot of that was what the mother in this book like attached herself to, was the idea of like, well, if anything can happen, like what insidious things are like afoot in a place like this, you know? And also just the fact that there aren't like, it was a place inhabited mostly by elderly people, so what are elderly people's fascination with children, you know? Is there a sense of like nostalgia for lost youth? Obviously through the Otto Hazard characters, there's this sort of like perverted sense of sexuality, sort of, where he almost, you know, because his son is never going to really grow up mentally to be able to be a man in his language anyway, and talk to him in that way. He sort of almost like in a Freudian way then goes and dates somebody who would be like Wilson's sort of appropriate person, which is Jean. Like they're probably sort of mentally at the same age at this point in time. So yeah, it was definitely about characters. I had a writing teacher, Sherry Gable, who like had a big like blonde ponytail and drove an old Saab and would like pull up, and she was like, everyone was always talking about like what Sherry Gable's love life was like, and did she have a love life? And for a while she was dating this like kind of what we thought was like rich farmer guy, Marty, who had like a horse barn with like cross country and jumps and everything somewhere, and she would come tearing into the driveway and then like yell at all of her horses and get on and show them what to do. And she was really my first view of like, okay, I want to be that woman. So yeah, people were a big part of it, I think. And also the feeling of like the mother's fear about other people, which I think is something that's kind of contrasted in the book, is like kids don't necessarily always, they have good instincts about people, I think, you know, and they know when there's tensions and they kind of know they can scope people out, but kids always go into meeting anybody with a super open eye and open heart, like, because they don't have any reason to think that that's not what you do, you know? So I think some of the mom's paranoia contrasted with Jean's, like, wide-eyed wonder at this place was a big part of, like, the beginning of the conflict of what happens for them.